Today's topic is a follow-up from my last video about shutter speed. I'm going back to basics again and will tell you everything you need to know about aperture. It's all happening on today's episode of
Ask David Bergman.
Hey there everybody, welcome back. Here I am, as always, answering your photography questions right here on Adorama TV. If you've got a photo question, you certainly know what to do by now. Just go to askdavidbergman.com and submit that form on the site. I just might pick your question to answer here on a future show. I know I always mention my Shoot from the Pit live concert photography workshops. I'm thrilled to say that my North American dates are just about all sold out. Thanks so much for that. It really is a once-in-a-lifetime experience for photographers to learn how to shoot concerts at a real live show. There are still spots open in New Zealand, Australia, and countries all across Europe, so go to shootfromthepit.com for more info and to sign up. Hope to see you out on the road sometime this year. Okay, so a couple of weeks ago, I did a video called Shutter Speed Basics. Someone sent in a question about it, so I broke down how shutter speed works and why you'd choose to change it. In the comments of that video, Randy F. posted this. He said, "Excellent refresher for those still learning the basics. This video really clarified the properties of shutter speed. Hopefully you will do matching tutorials for aperture and even ISO. Newer photographers will love you for it. Kudos." Well, Randy, thanks for that comment. I thought that was a fantastic idea. Now, I've done videos before about how ISO works, but let me know down in the comments if you want me to go over all the aspects of it in one complete video just like this. Today, however, I'm going to tackle aperture. So let's start with what is aperture. Now, unlike shutter speed, aperture is not in your camera body, it's in the lens. There are aperture blades that open up to create a roundish space that lets light through. They form an iris just like the colored iris in your eye that opens up your pupils. In a dark room, the iris opens up, making the pupil bigger so that more light can come through. We all know how that works. The same thing actually happens in a camera lens. When you take a picture, the aperture blades move, creating an opening for light to go through. When the exposure is done, the blades close back down to be ready for the next picture. Now, light is measured in photons. I always think of the photon torpedoes in Star Trek. That's how I remember that. So by controlling how wide that opening is, we can decide how many photons we want to go through that lens. Aperture is one piece of the exposure triangle, so it has an effect on how bright or how dark our images are. The wider the opening, the more photons get through, the more light hits our image sensor in the camera, assuming, of course, your shutter speed stays the same, and the brighter your image. A smaller opening lets less light through, and that makes your image darker. Now, just like shutter speed, aperture is measured in stops. New photographers sometimes get confused by the numbers because they seem backwards at first, with the lower numbers being bigger aperture openings. That's actually because the number is the denominator of a fraction, not the numerator. It's the number on the bottom. If f was 1, for example, then 1 over 4, or 1/4, is a bigger number than 1 over 16, or 1/16. So f4 is a bigger opening than f16. So f in the numerator is actually focal length. That's what that stands for. The focal length over the f number is your f-stop, which is a measurement of the entrance pupil. Now, you don't have to memorize any of that. It doesn't really matter. What you have to know is that each of the numbers is one stop from the next. So f5.6 to f8 is one stop, and f8 to f11 is also one stop. Therefore, 5.6 to 11 is two stops. Now, sometimes we might say that f8 is one stop darker than 5.6. That's because f8 closes down the aperture one stop, making our image darker. Now, to adjust your f-stop, you should see those numbers somewhere on your camera. Most cameras come preset to adjust in third stop increments when you start to make that change. That gives you more control over your exposure because you don't have to jump one full stop at a time. So when moving from 5, 6 to 8, you're going to see 6.3, then 7.1, and finally f8. Now, all lenses have a minimum and a maximum aperture. The minimum aperture is the smallest opening, and at least with a normal DSLR lens, they're usually going to max out at f16, 22, or 32. On the other end, maximum aperture is how wide the lens can open up, and that number could be anywhere from 5.6 or so, all the way down to 1.4 or 1.2. That number is usually more important when you're buying a lens because having access to wider apertures allows you to shoot in lower light and create some cool looks, which I'm going to talk about shortly. Lenses with wider maximum apertures are usually going to be bigger and more expensive because they have larger optics or pieces of glass. For example, you can buy a 50mm lens with a maximum aperture of 1.8 for around $125. A 50mm with a maximum aperture of 1.4 is more like $350, and a 51.2 lens can be anywhere from $1,400 to well over $2,000 for the newest top of the line. Zoom lenses are more complex and generally aren't available with the widest apertures that you have on similar prime lenses. So now that you know what you're buying, why would you change your aperture and what impact does it have on the look of your photos? Well, I already mentioned exposure. Just like shutter speed, any change in your aperture is going to make your images brighter or darker. Outdoors, you might close down your aperture to get the brightness level that you want for that picture, while indoors, you would have to open up a lot more to let enough light in to get the same exact exposure. Now remember, sidebar here, I highly recommend shooting in manual exposure mode. That means you pick all three settings in the exposure triangle: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. If you're on any kind of an auto mode where the camera picks at least one of those three settings, then you're letting the camera decide how bright or how dark your image turns out. You're the photographer, you're creating the image. The camera can't possibly know how you want your pictures to look. Maybe you're a wedding photographer and your style is to shoot bright, punchy photos with high-key backgrounds and blown-out faces. Or maybe you're a fine art photographer who likes dark and moody photos that are all black with just one little sliver of light coming through. It's totally up to you as the creative person to consciously make those decisions. Don't leave it up to the camera. But besides exposure, your aperture affects your images in another important way. It changes your, what we call, depth of field. If you were taking a picture of me and focused on my eyes, everything that's on the same focus plane as my eyes, so everything directly left and right, would be in focus. Now this assumes you're not using anything crazy like a tilt shift lens, but we're just talking about a normal lens you'd buy for a DSLR or a mirrorless camera. The focus plane is parallel to the sensor in your camera, and there's an area a little in front and a little behind that we perceive to be in focus. By the way, I said that very consciously, perceived to be in focus. If you want to go down a crazy rabbit hole, read up about how our eyes perceive focus. It's fascinating, but also kind of made my head explode. Google that at your own risk and then tell me how it went. I made the mistake of going down that tunnel. Anyway, the thickness of the area that's considered to be in focus, that's called your depth of field. The smaller the aperture, so that's the bigger numbers like f11, f16, f22, smaller apertures, those numbers are going to give you a wider depth of field, a thicker depth of field. So more of your image is going to be in focus from front to back. Wider apertures like f4, 2.8, f2, and smaller, those are going to give you a shallower depth of field. So the area in front of me and behind me is going to go out of focus a lot more. It's going to go out of focus faster the further away you get. I took this picture of Angie at f16. That's a very small opening. Now the background isn't in focus because it's really far away, but you can see branches and some detail in the trees. Now when I open up my aperture to f4, look what happens to that same background. It gets way more out of focus. The wider aperture has narrowed my depth of field, and the same background now looks completely different. By the way, I always like to say that the technical part of photography is a give and take. Give somewhere and you have to take somewhere else. When I took the second picture at f4, I was opening up my aperture 4 stops from the f16 photo. So that image would have been 4 stops brighter. To compensate, I had to slow down my shutter speed 4 stops to get the same amount of light so my image wasn't completely blown out and overexposed. Now, whether you want to shoot with a large or a shallow depth of field is totally a creative choice. It's up to you. There's no right or wrong. When I shoot portraits, my personal preference is to use a wide open aperture so that the background is as out of focus as possible. My subject is going to jump off the frame more if there's nothing else to distract you. This is at f8, and the building back there really pulls my eye away from Sammy. But since I was using my Canon 85mm lens that has a maximum aperture of 1.4, I was able to adjust my shutter speed and open up my aperture all the way to turn it into this. The background just fades away at this point, and all you can see is Sammy. So those are all reasons why you'd want to shoot with wide apertures. Are there any downsides? Well, if your depth of field is very small, you need to make sure that you nail your focus. I made this shot of my musician friend Patrick McLachlan at 1.4. One eye is in focus while the other is out of focus. Now that's the look I wanted for this image, but my depth of field is maybe an inch or two, so I had to really get that close eye in focus. Truth be told, I shot a lot of frames like this to make sure that I got one where it was just perfect. Another potential issue is that you simply might have too much light to shoot wide open. If you're outdoors in bright daylight, you might have lowered your ISO all the way and sped up your shutter speed as much as possible. With all that, it still might be too bright to shoot at 1.4 or 2.8, so you can't get that super shallow depth of field look you might want. Now, there are some tricks you can do, like using a neutral density filter over your lens, but that's an extra thing you're going to need to have on you, so make sure you're prepared if that's something you want to do. Now, lastly, there's simply the issue of cost. As I've said before, lenses with wider maximum apertures are going to cost more than the equivalent lens with a smaller aperture. If you really need the widest apertures and don't have the budget, you should consider using prime lenses instead of zooms. A good 24-70 2.8 is going to cost at least $1,200, while if you give up the zoom and just get a 50mm prime, you can get a 1.8 aperture. That's a stop and a third wider than the zoom for $125. Now, there are other issues that affect image quality that might come into play with an inexpensive lens, but just from the aperture standpoint, it's something to consider. So I've been talking all this time about wide apertures. What about the small ones? Why might you decide to close down your aperture? Well, I already talked about depth of field. Maybe you want a wider depth of field in your image. Again, I don't usually shoot that way, but it's 100% your choice, up to you. And I've already talked a couple times about how aperture affects exposure. I like to use small apertures when I'm shooting with flash and want to eliminate all the ambient light. If I only want my flash to light the scene, I can't have any of the existing light, the ambient light, whether that's the lights in the room or the sun outside. I want to close down my aperture enough so that I have a black frame before beginning to add in my flash. This shot of Sammy's sister Jackie is outdoors, but entirely lit by a powerful studio strobe. I'm at 250th of a second at f/16. I also close down my aperture when I'm using flash and just want to darken my background without killing it completely. This works particularly well with skies. For this portrait of Luke Combs, I'm at 100 ISO, 200th of a second at f/16. I first got my exposure for the background and found that f/16 darkened that sky just enough to make it look how I wanted. But of course, Luke would be way too dark. Then I just added in some flash to light him up against that perfect sky. Now, to make this long exposure flash shot of my buddy Kurt Ozon, I had to slow down my shutter speed to 1 whole second. I was at 200 ISO and didn't want any of the room light to come into my frame, so I closed down my aperture to f/16. At a wider aperture, I would have had to speed up my shutter speed, and I wouldn't have had enough time for him to move to those two positions to make the photo I wanted. I need an entire second so that I could start the frame, use the flash, have him move, and freeze up that picture exactly how I wanted it. Now, one downside of shooting closed down all the way is that you might see a phenomenon called diffraction. Your images will actually be less sharp at smaller apertures like f/22, f/32. I'm not talking out of focus, but just the quality is not going to be quite as good. Landscape and fine art photographers really need to keep this in mind and don't just shoot at f/32 because you want everything in focus. If the best image quality is your number one goal, then it's better to open up your lens a bit. I've found that the sweet spot for most lenses is around 2 to 3 stops down from its maximum aperture. So for a 2.8 lens, that means anywhere from 5.6 to f/8. Now that doesn't mean it looks bad at every other aperture, but if you're going to pixel peep, that's where it's going to look best. Now, when I shoot pictures of my old negatives on a light table to digitize them, I use my Canon RF 100mm 2.8 macro lens. This is my picture of Tom Brady scoring his first ever playoff touchdown. He ran the ball in during the Patriots' win over the Raiders in the famous 2002 Tuck Rule game. I shot the negative at f/8 for the highest possible image quality. Every pixel matters when it comes to converting my old images to digital. Now, one last thing to watch out for when shooting small apertures is that if you have an open sky in your photo, the smaller apertures is sometimes going to show any sensor dust you might have in your camera. I've done a video about cleaning your sensor that has some examples, but if that's an issue for you, then opening up your aperture might help cover it up a bit. I'm going to put a link to that video down below so you can see how to clean your sensor or maybe why you wouldn't want to. So there you go. That's everything I can think of about aperture, what it is, why you decide to open or close it. Let me know what I missed down in the comments below. I'm sure there's a few things you guys have that I didn't think of. And again, many of these choices are purely creative. There is no right or wrong way. Totally up to you. Decide how you want your images to look and then use the best setting to create it. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. You get me all tongue-tied. Thank you. Do me a favor. Go ahead and like, subscribe, hit that bell icon for notifications. Hope to see you at one of my live workshops this year, and I'll be back next time right here with a brand new question on Ask David Bergman.